Okay, here we are, boys and girls, for your very last, can you believe it? I'm sure you're all really sad, but it's your very last lecture on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's really only going to cover just the last couple of days of the crisis. So as we launch into this and start talking about how all of these events, these dramatic events, how they ultimately ended, I think it's important that we start off before we start talking about, the next day and what happened, that we just really, first of all, briefly review what had happened in our last lecture, and also talk about some of the personalities that are important to understand. So we had been talking about October 26th in the last lecture, and on October 26th, one of the critical things that occurred was that Khrushchev had sent a letter to Kennedy saying that he would agree to remove missiles from Cuba as long as the United States agreed never to invade Cuba. Now, keep in mind that this is amidst the quarantine, and this is amidst all of the mounting pressure. So it's not as if this just sort of came out of nowhere. This came in part as a response to the actions that the United States was taking, in part because of what was going on at the United Nations. At the time, the United Nations was starting to meet and discuss the events going on in Cuba, and also because of what was happening in Cuba itself and between the U.S. and the Soviet Union with regards to the quarantine. The quarantine, remember, which they called a quarantine because a blockade would have been actually a sign of war, an indication of war, so they called it a quarantine. So that is what happened on the 26th. But before we start talking about the 27th, I want to talk to you about this guy. This is a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. And we've talked a little bit about Khrushchev in the past. I have told you guys about his famous speech where he took his shoe off and he banged the table and said, "We will crush you." I mean, this guy was fierce. He was a fierce Cold Warrior. He took over after Stalin. And I think this character is a really interesting one because who's going to take over after Stalin? Stalin, this guy who killed millions of people in the purges, who was so paranoid. In some ways, Khrushchev had to come into power and repair the party. Stalin had done a significant amount of damage, not just because he had killed so many people inside the party, but because there was so much internalized fear, and there was also a lot of competition amongst people within the highest levels of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had to have this balance of being a really tough guy and making a hard line and supporting those hardliners within the party, but he also had to be someone who could work to sort of rebuild the party, to bring people into it, and in some ways kind of restore people after the really, really dark days of Stalin. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev had already established himself as a tough guy. He had, made his speech. He'd come to the United States and, had this really diplomatically successful trip to the U.S. where, Americans didn't really know what to think of him. They saw him as kind of this cute little teddy bear guy traveling through Disneyland, but at the same time knew he was this really fierce and scary opponent in some ways as well. So he played these roles really, really quite well. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy had this sort of strange mirror situation that they were in. When Khrushchev and the Soviets put those missiles in Cuba, they did not, by all accounts and based on the contemporary readings of KGB documents that have been released since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviets, while they realized that putting those weapons in Cuba would be seen as a direct threat to the United States, starting the Third World War was not something that anybody was looking to do, at least no one who was sane. And whatever you say about Stalin, and I've said plenty about him and his instability psychologically, but Khrushchev was not crazy. This was not a man who, had lost touch with reality. And no one sane wanted to start World War III. And Khrushchev was not someone who was prepared to start World War III. Although he did want to repel what he believed to be the oppressive attacks of the Americans. He, like Stalin before him and people in the party, saw the American presence in Greece and Turkey as a threat. They saw the money that we were giving to Western allies, as well as Greece and Turkey, as nothing but a capitalist bribe. And also, he was hearing from his partner, Fidel Castro, that the Americans were trying to kill him and overthrow this fledgling communist country. And we can't deny that we were trying to do that. We absolutely were. So here is Khrushchev now, essentially with the placement of these missiles setting in motion World War III potentially. And he himself was sending telegrams and was leading a lot of the messaging going on within the Politburo, or within the highest ranking political groups in the Soviet Union. That's what the Politburo is. It was the political wing of the Communist Party. He had to lead them, but he also had to satisfy these really hard liners. There were people within the Politburo, people within the political wing of the Soviet Union, who believed that they needed to take swift, direct military action to repel the American threat, and that if it meant using nuclear weapons, well, then that's what it meant. Sound familiar at all? You have a leader who has people within their organization who believe in swift action, even if it comes to using nuclear force, to repel the threat of their enemy. If you consider the circumstances, what Khrushchev was facing was in some ways comparable to what Kennedy was facing. Kennedy also had hardliners within his administration who he needed to satisfy. People who believed, like we've talked about, hawkishly in the use of nuclear weapons, and if it came to it, World War III, to repel what they considered to be this really dangerous threat of the Soviet Union. So here Kennedy and Khrushchev find themselves in some ways a mirrored situation. But the day before, on the 26th, as we talked about, Khrushchev had sent a message saying, okay, we'll remove our weapons if you promise never to invade Cuba. Because remember, that was the original reason for putting those weapons there in the first place. Now here it becomes important to understand, of all things, the international dateline, because understanding that the United States, and I'm looking up at my clocks on my wall because I'm in my classroom, and you guys, as you know, I have all these clocks on my wall over here that indicate different times around the world. The Soviet Union is about 9 hours. Moscow's about 9 hours, maybe even 10 hours ahead of Washington, D.C. So we have this huge time delay. So if the United States receives a message on the teletype at 8 o'clock at night, that meant that instead of it being 8 o'clock at night, it was 6 in the morning, right? So if they're ahead of us, you're going to have to move that clock that much further ahead. And so the Soviet Union was quite a bit ahead of us in terms of, or let me just think that, yeah, so I want to make sure I'm giving you accurate information. So they were ahead of us in time. Well, this time difference becomes important because the Soviet Union, in fact, overnight, so in the U.S., it was overnight. So the night of the 26th, everybody goes to bed in Washington, D.C., thinking, okay, we've got a deal. We're absolutely going to have a deal here. We're going to promise never to invade Cuba, and the Soviets are going to remove their weapons. Everybody goes to bed, crossing their fingers, hoping everything's going to work out. Overnight, a new letter came in from Moscow, and the letter was, by all accounts, initially received as being from Khrushchev. And this letter dramatically shifts positions. There is no nicey nice talk about we'll remove our weapons. There's no kind of compromise discussion about, okay, well, we'll just We'll remove our weapons if you promise never to invade. Now it's a hardline message saying, absolutely not. We will not remove these weapons unless the United States agrees to remove its weapons from Greece and Turkey. Now, we talked about this idea earlier because it was an idea that had come up within XCOM to remove the weapons from Greece and Turkey. What many people believe is that that idea must have somehow been leaked and gotten out to the communications network within the KGB in the United States, and that that message was somehow relayed back to the Soviet Union. It shouldn't surprise us, right? Because there were these talks going on with this KGB operative in Washington, D.C. So the message gets back not just to Khrushchev, but it leaks into the other members of the Politburo. And what the Kennedy administration receives is an angry response, essentially from the hardliners within the Politburo, saying that they will not accept a negotiation that includes anything less than our full withdrawal from Greece and Turkey. This is a completely different stance than the Kennedy administration trying to quietly do a backroom deal over the weapons in Greece and Turkey. Now, publicly, we would be having to bow to the demands of the Soviets if we took those weapons out. And the United States felt strongly, and the Kennedy administration was under intense pressure not to cave to that kind of demand. I mean, again, it becomes this like competition of, who's tougher, and nobody wants to back down. But in particular, nobody wants to look like they're kind of the wuss, right, that has to take the deal. On that same day, amidst all of this tension and this new letter coming out, an American U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba, and an American pilot was killed. This was an American U-2 plane that was on a routine surveillance trip, much like the ones portrayed in the film, and that American pilot was shot down. He became the only actual military casualty of the United States from the Cuban Missile Crisis. But his death, again, think about the rules of engagement that the military have. Our fighters are now being fired upon. And the Kennedy administration has this intense pressure. The Soviets are backing down from their deal. These hardliners have taken over. They even believed there might have been a coup within the Kremlin or within the Soviet Union to overthrow Khrushchev. The Americans had no idea what was going on. I mean, it was starting to get extremely scary, extremely quickly. At the same time, an American is shot down over Soviet airspace, and things could not have been more tense. The Kennedy administration, Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy met privately, without the interference of some of their other advisors and without the interference of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy decide that they're going to make a move. John Kennedy asks Bobby Kennedy to very quietly go to the Soviet embassy. And on the night of the 27th, Bobby Kennedy gets in a car, goes to the Soviet embassy, and has a secret meeting with the Soviet ambassador. And in that meeting, Bobby Kennedy says, we cannot publicly remove those weapons from Cuba. What they believed had happened was they had believed that the hardliners within Khrushchev's administration were pushing him hard to make this deal. And they, in some senses, might have recognized that Khrushchev was in a similar position that they were. And so this secret agreement being struck was intended to both satisfy the hardliners within the Soviet Politburo and also give the Kennedys the option of not looking like they had caved into Soviet demands. So here's what Bobby Kennedy proposed. He said, we cannot publicly agree to take our weapons out of Greece and Turkey. But what we can do is we can make a private agreement that those weapons will be removed, but they won't be removed for several months after this whole situation chills out, so that no one will draw the link between us removing those weapons and the end of this conflict. I mean, do you see the goal here? The goal is, we talked about the notion of plausible deniability. The Kennedys can deny that this was a deal, that this was part of the deal. They can essentially look like they got the Soviets to agree to back down. The Soviets can get the Americans to take their weapons out of Greece and Turkey, and everybody wins, or so they hope. But remember, this is only a proposal. And on the night of the 27th, Bobby Kennedy goes back to the White House and has no idea if they're going to accept it. But what he does know is if they don't accept this deal, there's nowhere else to go except to World War III. Fortunately, that night, and again, Kennedy writes a letter to Khrushchev stating that they will agree to this. On October 28th, Khrushchev makes a formal announcement on Radio Moscow that he has agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. And it was that announcement that signaled to the Kennedy administration and, frankly, to everybody else in the world that the crisis was coming to an end. And it was that simple and that complicated, right? I mean, it certainly wasn't simple, and it was over. What Kennedy and Khrushchev had both realized was that they both needed an out. Everybody wanted out of this situation. But both sides also had these hardliners, had these hawkish people that really felt that the only way out was to kind of go after each other. Kennedy, in the film 13 Days, talks about World War I in this book that he had read called The Guns of August, and how the military commanders in World War I, one of the reasons why World War I dragged on tragically for so long with all the shelling and all those young men killed in the trenches in Europe, was because each side, each military, believed that it understood the other side so well that they could predict each other's movements. And there was this almost ego about it, this sense of, we know them so well, this is how they're going to react. And the problem was they didn't really know each other very well, and they weren't putting themselves in each other's position. And so the fighting dragged on and on and on. And, the reflection on this idea was something that Kennedy wrote about. And he wrote extensively after the Cuban Missile Crisis about the need for us to sort of slow down our march to war. And this really marked a shift for Kennedy in his foreign policy and his public foreign policy. I want to read for you guys, on the next couple slides, I have some excerpts from a speech that Kennedy made at Washington University at the commencement in June of 1963. So we're talking about like 7-8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is what Kennedy had to say. So read along with me while I read. It says, "I have therefore chosen this time and this place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth is too rarely perceived. Yet it is the most important topic on earth, world peace. What kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Romana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about a genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age when great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age when a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by 11 of the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need to use them is essential to keeping the peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears. But we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of world peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitude as individuals and as a nation. For our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace, should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, and toward freedom and peace here at home. That is a radical shift. That is a mood that the Kennedy administration was setting in early to mid-1963. Post-Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was changed. I mean, how could you not be changed by these events? Tragically, as you guys know, we're talking about these words being spoken in June of 1963. And through June, July, August, September, October, Kennedy campaigned. An election was upon them. And on a campaign stop in Dallas, Texas, in November of 1963, John Kennedy was assassinated. He was assassinated on a public street in an open-air limousine. Most people, when they think of Kennedy, that's what they think of. They think of his assassination. When asked what she thinks, and many people think of the controversies, the sort of conspiracy theories regarding the Kennedy administration. And there are many conspiracy theories. One of the most prominent conspiracy theories, and one of them that came immediately to people's minds, people felt that it could have been Cuba, that the Cubans might have actually had Kennedy killed. And considering that, he was trying to kill Castro along with the CIA, it might not seem too far-fetched. Others felt that it might have been the mafia, for various reasons related to some of the political dealings of the Kennedys. People felt that his mafia dealings might have led to his assassination. And still other people, including my father, who I think is a very interesting character to have this perspective. There were many people who believed that it was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that it was in fact a job done from the inside, from inside the Kennedy White House. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the theory goes, the Joint Chiefs of Staff seeing Kennedy's softening attitude, if you can call it softening. I mean, he certainly is not soft on communism, but this speech reflects a really different notion, this notion of think about those words that he said right at the end of the portion that I read, that by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace and toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War and toward freedom here at home, he was saying we need to change our attitude towards the Soviet Union. So there are some that believe that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, believing that this was a dangerous circumstance, that this circumstance, in fact, threatened the very safety and security of the United States, that he had to be eliminated. Now, you can believe whatever you want about the Kennedy assassination. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the Kennedy assassination, in part because I think that Kennedy's death should be mourned, and I don't think it should be treated as, sort of a spy novel kind of mystery. I think that whatever happened to John F. Kennedy, the outcome was that he became, a martyred president, a man who died, whose legacy was cut very short. And as his daughter, when his daughter Carolyn Kennedy was asked once what she thought of all the conspiracy theories regarding her father's death, and she said, that was the day my dad died. And it's not something, she said, I don't think about conspiracy theories. I think of it as the day my dad died. And I just think like that really kind of spoke to me that, sometimes I think we kind of tend to focus on the blood and guts of it a little bit, instead of what the legacy of the Kennedy administration is. The photograph that you've been looking at here for the last few minutes is John Kennedy on the right and his brother Bobby on the left. And as I mentioned earlier in this series of lectures, probably the greatest tragedy of this entire episode isn't just that John Kennedy was assassinated, because that is a tragedy, but while running for president in 1968, his brother Bobby was also assassinated. So this family, this wealthy Kennedy family with all this power, nonetheless suffers some really devastating tragedy in the loss by an assassin of both of these men. And I think it's a loss to the United States in many ways too, whenever a leader is killed. And so that's the end of the story. I mean, we've talked about the relationship that the United States has with Cuba. We still have this enduring issue with Cuba, though. We still have this anger that many people still feel towards Cuba, especially the Cuban exiles that still remain in our country. And so it remains to be seen what the next 40, 50 years have in store for us with regards to Cuba. But the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the notion of use of military power, the real consequences of a nuclear age, all of those things are something to be kept in mind. So, okay, well, that's that. Thank you for listening, you guys. And again, hope you've enjoyed this series. Okay.